us today. And I'd like to thank Mwazi as well for agreeing to moderate at this late notice. I just wanted to say that I need to please give you Eusebius's deepest apologies. He's had a family emergency, in fact a death in the family, very close family, that he's had to go to, so he apologizes profusely. He is watching the live stream as much as he can in between the funeral that is taking place, but he's asked me to please say he really is very sorry that he's not here. However, we do have Mwazi, who is more than adequate, more than important, and she's a woman, so it's amazing that she's here. You know, I'll give you a little bit of her background in a second. But I'd like to also welcome Advocate George Bezos, who is one of our board members. Advocate Bezos is one of the few board members who continuously come to our events. I'd like to welcome and thank the educators who also continuously bring the learners to the museum's events. These are educators who give up their personal time to be with us. They bring the learners to the museum, they understand the importance of out of the classroom learning, they realize the conscientization that takes place when young people come to these type of events. Thank you very much. And thank you to the learners for coming and bringing and spending your free time with us. Thank you very much. I think we can count ourselves very lucky that we have Mwazi with us. Mwazi Tosini, I think many of you may know her, recognize her. She's taken up the role of moderator in this panel discussion. She's an award-winning talk radio executive producer with almost a decade of experience crafting radio shows. I had to write it down, otherwise I would be telling you about my children and cats and stuff, so it's not long. Covered a wide range of not just the South African story, but the biggest global stories as well. Mwazi has produced news for ENCA, has worked with the best current affairs hosts, including people like Ridi Tabi, Dolani Kwala, Eusebius Makaiser, and CNN's Richard Quest. Mwazi is also a Ruth First Fellow at Wits University, and in addition to this, Mwazi is a poet, and as she puts it, a writer becoming. She's also a seasoned commentator and speaker and has many noteworthy achievements. She has produced broadcasts which include the ANC 2012 Mangwang Conference, Nelson Mandela's funeral, Winnie Madikizela-Mandela's funeral broadcast, amongst many other achievements. Thank you, Mwazi, for agreeing to step in. Thank you very much. We have one more apology. Nomfundo Walaza, who is a clinical psychologist, and who mediated in a lot of the events around Fees Must Fall, has had a tragic event take place. She called me last night. She was absolutely in a state of disrepair, and she's not here, unfortunately. She also proffers her sincere apologies. I want to thank the Forest, Funzani, Kusisiwe, and Ndukozo. We appreciate you, perhaps more than you realize. You made history and will more than likely continue to make history. I'd like to thank particularly also Asanda. Asanda was very instrumental in being a difficult conversation moderator in the times of the Four Fees Must Fall, and you will hear right now that she is one of the, I think for me, probably one of the best people to have on this panel, as someone who is perhaps sympathetic of the fallers, but has a different perspective perhaps on how things have played out, and maybe should have played out, or maybe did play out, but you will hear from her directly. I think the Fallers movement has shown South Africa once again what power lies in the hands of young people. In 1976, we saw the power that young people portrayed by standing up and together for a common cause. 1976 was the catalyst for change in South Africa. The Arab Spring in Egypt was mostly led by young people. Young people, you have power. Use it constructively. The Fallers movement brought to the forefront the inequality in access to education through a lack of finance, the unchanged curricula, the injustice of outsourced employees, amongst other really major issues. Young people started and led this movement. The question we pose today is whether the movement was successful. What were its successes? We are the leaders today. Does the movement still exist? Please use social media to speak about this event. Use the hashtag Youth Day, use the hashtag Apartheid Museum, and I'm sure it's going to be a great debate. Enjoy.
Good afternoon. Thank you all for your time. I'm not going to take too much of it. I would like for us to get straight into the conversation as quickly as possible. So I'm going to introduce the panel that we have today. How we're going to do this is that we're going to give each panel member about 7 minutes to sort of state their case right off the top of the bat. They will also each have 3 minutes to rebut any of their fellow panelists' presentation should they want to make comments. Right after that, we will then open it up to the audience should you have any comments or questions that you would want to direct to the panel in general or specific panelists or anything that you want to add to the conversation. What we wanted to do is make this conversation as collaborative as possible, and that's why I'm here. We do have a panel of incredible young people, but we also do want to hear from you, and that's why we've invited you here today as opposed to sitting just the 5 of us in some room and broadcasting it. So I do hope that you're going to join the conversation robustly. On my right, I've got Funzani Mthembu, who's a multifaceted personality and has found herself involved in movements such as Fees Must Fall and Outsourcing Must Fall. She is a finance graduate from the University of Johannesburg, currently pursuing her postgraduate studies at Wits University. She's also a member of the Pan-African Student Movement of Azania. She served as a member of the Soweto Women's Forum, a grassroots level women's organization which spoke against the violence Black women are currently facing in the country. Funzani also recently presented her paper on decoloniality in the context of South Africa at the Global Women and Girls Conference in Christopher Newport University in the United States. Welcome, Funzani. On my immediate left, I have Asanda Mwashe. She is a speaker, academic, and transformation expert and change agent who is known to facilitate difficult conversation using digital storytelling and other tools. She also founded the Decolonizing the Curriculum Movement seminar series and reading group at her institution and lectures the decolonized political and business reporting and editorial management courses. Welcome, Asanda. On my far right, we have Busisiwe Siebe. Busisiwe is a writer, activist, entrepreneur, Wits Fees Must Fall student leader, advocate for social justice. She graduated from Wits University with honors in political science, African literature, and international relations. She has worked for the Department of Basic Education, the United Nations International Children's Fund, as well as the Department of Arts and Culture on the Girls and Boys Education Movement as the national chairperson. Welcome, Busi. And last, but certainly not least, the thorn amongst the roses, we have Ntokozo Kwabe on my far left. He was one of the organizing members of the Rhodes Must Fall movement at Oxford University. Ntokozo was awarded the prestigious Rhodes Scholarship in 2014, which is famously dubbed the most prestigious academic honor in the world. He used the scholarship to study at the University of Oxford and recently graduated with a master's in public law, which is famously known as the Oxford BCL and as the toughest law degree in the world. Unfortunately, Ntokozo will be leaving us. Are you still leaving us to do your Masters of Public Law?
No.
Okay. We're keeping Ntokozo, which is great. And Ntokozo is well known for his public commentary around decolonization. And of course, as I've previously mentioned, his work with the Rhodes Must Fall movement when he was at Oxford University. Welcome, Ntokozo. So this brings us to the beginning of our conversation. I think that it is undeniable that in South Africa's political and social histories, young people have always played an integral role. And we continue to live in a country that has a youth bulge. We have one of the youngest populations in the world. And yet, we find ourselves in a situation where most of our leaders are, to be kind, not so young. And these are the people that are making the decisions that affect our daily lives, the decisions that shape our future. And it is within this context that the Fallist movement rose and became as important as it was. Of course, as we all know, today is the 16th of June, where we commemorate and also celebrate the work done by students in Soweto in 1976, that historic uprising, which I hope we all know about, that basically led to a situation where the cracks in the apartheid government really started showing themselves, and a breakdown of that system. The contribution of the students from 1976, as well as the Black conscious movement at the time, which had inspired them, the importance of that contribution cannot be underplayed. And to juxtapose that, we had in 2015, 2016, the Fallist movement, which began at the University of Cape Town with the Rhodes Must Fall movement, and of course spread across the country with the Fallist movement moving to Wits University with the Fees Must Fall movement, and essentially began to include most of the student bodies in this country. What we're here to discuss today is whether or not that movement succeeded in its political aims, one of which has been spoken about quite a bit in public discourse in this country, which is decolonization. That's what we're here to discuss today. We don't hope to have a final answer at the end of this conversation, but it is a conversation because it is important for us to begin to speak to one another and perhaps identify what some of the mistakes were, if there were any, and what some of the successes and triumphs of the movement were, if there were any, and what kind of space and place the movement can continue to have in our society going forward. So thank you for joining us. I'm going to ask Busi to give us her 7-minute presentation, speaking to the conversation that we're having today. Did the Fallists fail? Over to you, Busi.
Thank you very much. 7 minutes, I feel like I'm back at debating because you have to give like a presentation in 7 minutes. But thank you very much for the invitation. Did the Fallist movement fail? That is a very broad question. It's a very problematic question. And outside of it being problematic, it assumes that the Fallist movement is different from the youth of 76 in a particular manner. So for me, I believe that the Fallist movement didn't fail, but it was a continuation of what happened and started in 1976, particularly also around decolonization, because when looking at the youth of 76 and their refusal to be taught in a specific language, that was their way of essentially starting the conversation around decolonization. And decolonization, because we are the people who go to universities and we have the language to be able to say words like decolonization and transformation, is essentially what the youth of 76 were fighting for. So for me, did the Fallist movement fail? Yes and no. And I think this becomes the contradiction, right, of the Fees Must Fall movement, in the sense that it didn't fail the public, it didn't fail the generations that are coming after us, but it definitely did fail us as the youth and the generation of today. And the reasons why I say this is because Khanya Xesheke is still in jail at the moment. He's serving 8 years for Fees Must Fall. Amla is serving a year's house arrest, and there are many other comrades who have felt the brunt of the Fees Must Fall movement, who have essentially had to put the weight on themselves of carrying the consequences of the movement with them into their daily lives and the daily struggles, right? So has it failed us as particular individuals and activists? Yes. Has it failed the generations coming after us? No, because we have been able to get a pronouncement of free education. As problematic as that pronouncement is, it doesn't speak about the curriculum, it doesn't speak about the rollout plan, it doesn't essentially tie to the nitty-gritties and the specific demands that we had made under Fees Must Fall. We must also remember that Fees Must Fall is not uniform across all institutions. It started at UCT as the Rhodes Must Fall movement to remove the Rhodes statue, and then it came to other institutions and other universities, and particularly when looking at Rhodes University, it was essentially ushered in under the RU reference list, which was, you know, the femicide that was happening in Grahamstown at Rhodes University. So Fees Must Fall is taken and is introduced in a different manner across universities. And the fact that you assume that Fees Must Fall starts also in 2015 is problematic, because outside of it starting in 1976, it was there in UKZN around the year 2008. Yes, around 2008 on the 16th of July, UKZN had started a movement similar to Fees Must Fall, which was essentially around transformation. So we've always had the issue, and we've always looked at the decolonial element and free education from a variety of perspectives. It is only that in 2015 those perspectives were able to be consolidated around a movement that we now call Fees Must Fall. Have we failed? Like I said, yes, we failed ourselves as activists, because when we got the pronouncement, so Fees Must Fall, hey guys, can I talk to you actually? Let me give you the sauce. I want to give you the sauce. Funzani didn't want me to give you guys the sauce. She kept on texting me throughout the week like, we must structure what we're going to say so we don't contradict each other. But I'm ready to give you guys the sauce. So Fees Must Fall 2015 starts off. And as it starts off, we end up going to the union buildings. I'm sure everyone remembers, we go to the union buildings. That becomes a very big, momentous moment, right? And one thing that I realized when we're at the union buildings is that Fees Must Fall was not necessarily a struggle, but it was a moment in history. And it's very important for us to understand the fact that it was a moment and it wasn't a struggle, it wasn't a revolution. Because we kept on going around like, wow, waiting a revolution, we're in the midst of the revolution and this is what happens in a revolution. We must struggle, we must get shot, we must be stun grenaded. But essentially what we didn't realize was that we were in a moment in history, a moment in a revolution. But we tried to make it something that was bigger than that. So we go to the union buildings. After coming from the union buildings, the president, our favorite Baba, you know, Baba was like, no free education in 2015. We get back to our respective institutions of higher learning, and we have like a Skype meeting, right? And in that Skype meeting, we have particular political entities that are in Fees Must Fall say, you know what, guys, we tried. Maybe the next generation should take up the call. Let's all go back to class and let's all start writing our exams and continue on with the work of being students. And that becomes an important moment because of the fact that Fees Must Fall in 2015 was centered around political parties. It wasn't centered around the genuine call for free education. It was about political parties and who would be able to present or to deliver free education to this generation or the coming generation. Because come on, let's think about it. 2019, guess who's going to be campaigning around free education? Everyone. And everyone is going to need the youth vote around free education, and that's when they're going to start saying, we delivered free education, we were there. I mean, the EFF has already picked up the narrative, the ANC has already picked up the narrative, the PAC, I'm waiting for them also to say, we were also there somewhere in the free education element. So in 2015, Fees Must Fall becomes a political entity, a political tool for the higher powers above, who are old and grey and still in parliament, to be able to influence what's going to happen in 2019. At that particular point in time, we obviously didn't think about it that way. We thought, no man, you know, the EFF and the ANC and the PAC and all these other political parties are here to help us. They want to make sure that we get this free education. I mean, the EFF was constantly in parliament saying we want free education, and the ANC was like, you know, free education is a policy that we had from 1994, but no one was willing to essentially give out the decree of free education. No one was able to put it into policy. So after 2015 happens and we find out that many of our leaders are being paid to be in the movement, are being paid to dismantle the movement, are being paid essentially to set up a propaganda around the movement, we decide to depoliticize the movement. We decide we can't now work according to political parties. As an EFF member, I take off my t-shirt and I burn it and I say, if I'm going to continue on with this movement, and this is where I start leading the movement, I'm going to need to make sure that everyone is depoliticized. There's no ANC here, there's no EFF, there's no PAC. We're just going to have to be activists and genuine students. And for me, when we say, did the Flawless movement fail? We failed ourselves because we thought we could do it outside of politics. But it is going to benefit generations that are coming after us. And I think from that perspective, I would like to say we haven't failed.
Thank you, Vusi. All right, Ntokozo?
Thank you. I don't know where to begin. I actually wanted to begin by scolding Eusebius, but he's not here.
You can scold
Because-
me instead.
Because I found the formulation of the topic to be quite problematic. I mean, did the Flawless movement fail? It almost feels as if we have to respond to a negative statement. Why couldn't it be, did the Flawless movement succeed? Something positive that we can move from. Or, did the Flawless movement fail or succeed? Do you get what I mean? Like
Yeah.
you sort of move with sort of neutral ground, because I mean, at the end of the day, these panels are not neutral. How topics are framed are not neutral, and they do sort of impact how then they are conceived when we have to respond to them. And I would be very disappointed if all we do in this panel is to respond to whether we failed or not. I think there is more that we need to speak about. I don't think it's possible to understand or to determine whether or not the Flawless movement, and maybe on that point actually there's an important distinction that needs to be made. You need to distinguish between Fees Must Fall and the Flawless movement. The Flawless movement is a movement for decolonization, and it starts circa around Rhodes Must Fall at UCT, but it also spreads globally. I mean, at Harvard, you've got, movements that emerge. At Oxford, you've got movements that emerge. As far as India, at JNU, you've got movements that emerge. And all of them are speaking the language of decolonization. And, when we interrogate whether or not this movement has failed or has succeeded, I think we've got to place it in that context. Where does it come from? What are its stated objectives? And really, I mean, what is it about and how does it come about? Now, I think we'll all agree that the Rhodes Must Fall movement comes out of a deep disgruntlement among black students, in particular about not only just universities and how universities operate as racist institutions and institutions that reify and that alienate black bodies, but also South African society in general. So the Flawless movement is an entry point to a broader discussion about how South African society has emerged and serves or doesn't serve the interests of black people. It is its conversation that it is really trying to spark goes beyond universities. It really is about black liberation. And that's where the narrative around black liberation becomes important. But then you may ask yourself, well, why speak about black liberation 23 years after democracy? Because those are the kind of questions that we were confronted with. So it is those kind of questions that I think the Flawless movement in general raises. It's not about, yes, fees are important, but fees are important insofar as decommodification is an ideal that decolonization strives for. That's the importance of fees. But otherwise, I think if we are going to have a debate about, well, fees, we got fees or we didn't get fees, a revolution is not a one-time moment. Audre Lorde did tell us this a very long time ago. The movement, we can't speak about it in past tense. The Flawless movement continues, the struggle continues, and in fact, it would be a travesty to start speaking about us in history and to start writing books about us in ways that venerate or in ways that denounce us when we haven't stopped. We are here and we are going to decolonize. And South Africa is going to be a decolonized society and we are going to be Azania at the end of the day.
Okay, so I'm coming from a slightly different perspective in that I don't necessarily consider myself as a fallist, but I do consider myself a supporter of the fallist movement. I agree with the previous speakers that the problem statement is quite problematic because it puts us on a negative footing, but we'll try and tackle it. I think the key thing to highlight for me is that I think, as Busisi very aptly put it, the movement has failed the people who gave their lives, who gave their careers, who gave their university degrees to it. And so in that sense, I wouldn't even say actually it's the movement that's failed those people. I would say it's South Africa that's failed those people. I would say as a society, we continue to fail those young people who have done so much for all of us. I think that there's a lot that happened that we have to acknowledge, but there's a lot that was happening before. And so I think it's important for us to link what was there before the so-called fees must fall and what became after. And so I think it's important for us to always understand that this era, this conversation around decolonization, it's not a new conversation. You know, the whole of the African continent from as early as the 50s, as the 60s, was talking about what are we going to do as countries when the colonizers leave? How are we going to think of ourselves? How are we going to educate our children? What are we going to do with our land? And all of those conversations. And so we always need to remember that actually South Africa is coming to the conversation at a very late stage because we only received our so-called freedom in 1994. And I say that because a lot of people ask this question of, yeah, what is this decolonization thing? Where were you people? Well, it's been there. It's always been there. And it may be that a lot of people don't recognize it because it used to be called post-colonial thought, and it used to be called post-colonial theory, and much older people will tell you that they were already studying it at university. And so from a perspective of concept and content and theory, it's always been there. From a perspective of student movements and student protests, we can talk to 1976, we can talk to everything that happened between 1976 and the Fallers, but we can also talk to the fact that every single year, SRCs all over the country, every single year without fail, at different times, were protesting at their institutions against high fees, against the exclusion of black students. And so even that was not necessarily unique. So the question then becomes, what is it that was unique about this movement, and why do we talk about it in such terms of reverence, and why do we pinpoint it as a particular moment in time? The reason for that is because what Fees Must Fall did is that for the first time, all universities came together and spoke with the same voice. So that while before UCT could quell student protest, VETS could quell student protest, the University of Venda could quell student protest, for the first time institutions could not quell the movement or the uprising because it was happening at the same time and it was at a coordinated effort. And then in terms of what then became part of Fees Must Fall and Roads Must Fall, which was the outsourcing movement for labor at institutions, even that was not new. Because I remember a time when I was already working at Wits University, when the now current, what is his spokesperson, Bwiseni Josi, who's currently with the EFF, was in the Wits labor union. And he was fighting for this very insourcing of workers and an end to the outsourcing of workers at Wits University, long before Fees Must Fall. So what made it particularly special and particularly a powerful movement is that it was a united voice across all campuses in South Africa, speaking the same language at the same time and coordinating and organizing in a united way. And I think the second thing about it is that fees must fall, roads must fall. We can debate a lot of things about it and about what it stood for. But the one thing that we know for sure is that it changed the discourse in South Africa. So there was a time where you were a radical person or you were a conspiracy theorist if you spoke about how we live in a white supremacist patriarchal country and a white supremacist patriarchal world in general. But Fees Must Fall made it possible for us to speak about South Africa being a white supremacist patriarchal society, for us to be able to engage with what do we mean when we talk about South Africa being a white supremacist patriarchal country. What it also did is that it changed the tone, because before that, because of the discourse of reconciliation of Nelson Mandela, whom we revere and are grateful to a point, because of that discourse, black people were begging white people for freedom. Black people were begging white people for reverence, for respect, for inclusion, for all of these things that we should never have been begging for. And what Fees Must Fall did is that for the first time, it said actually the time is now, and so it brought a sense of urgency that wasn't there, that we can no longer continue to talk about diversity and transformation as simply just adding black. And that just by having black students in your school, it does not make that school transform. And just by having black students in your university, it does not make that university suddenly transformed. God, just pay attention. And so what is important again is that we need to understand that the other aspect of it that was particularly poignant was the way in which, even when the students were talking about decolonizing the curriculum, they understood what it was that they wanted. They understood how they wanted it to happen. And so in the minute that I have left, what I would like us to discuss, or where I'm hoping this discussion will go to, is the future. And so we have free education for those who earn less than 350,000, which means you still have to do the Oppression Olympics and go and beg and prove your poverty. But at least you know that if you earn less than 350,000, you kind of sort of guaranteed. And that's if NSFAS comes around before June to your institution to actually give you your money. But the future for me, and where I've been spending a lot of my time focusing, is what does this decolonizing of a curriculum mean? How do we build student capacity for decolonizing? How do we speak to the Department of Basic Education to actually deliver a decolonized curriculum at basic education level so that students are not being confronted with a decolonized curriculum at university level? And how do we destroy this banking education that has students expecting us as lecturers to come and deliver content and knowledge into their brains, and has them believing that at the end of the day, when they get their degree, they're going to be able to press those buttons and put in a pin and somehow receive knowledge? That is where I'm concerned with us going. How do we give students the capacity to think about the curriculum as something that they also own, as something that they are also partners in? Because what we have at the moment is students who want a decolonized education, but they actually don't know how to access it. They don't have the language that is required to access that decolonized curriculum. And they don't have the capacity because they come from an undecolonized basic education system. And so what we need to be looking at and what we need to be spending our energies on is how do we develop young people who have a capacity to negotiate, young people who have a capacity to gain a voice in conversations of power. Because although Fees Must Fall was able to bring this country to its knees, we still have not spoken about the fact that young people of ages of 18 and 19 and 20 were being left alone in boardrooms with grown men who have whole MBAs, who have whole management degrees, and they were being told that they were going to be able to negotiate fairly with these people.
Yeah. Thank you so much. At this time, I would like to ask any of the panelists if they want to make
exercise, well, except for you, Dozo, you've only got 30 seconds. If you want to exercise your opportunity to rebut anything that's been said thus far.
I think for me, like to answer the question of whether or not the forest movement in particular, because I think, as Untogozo says, there needs to be a distinction between the forest movement and fees must fall, right? For me, to answer the question of whether or not we have failed as a movement, I think we need to actually look back at the very moment of Hout Must Fall in 2015 and the action or the act of throwing poo into a statue that represented oppression. And that for me, I think emanates from a transgenerational trauma that the youth of today are actually experiencing, right? And what that is essentially a cumulative and collective psychological and emotional injury sustained over a lifetime and across generations, resulting from massive group trauma experiences. The magnitude of the trauma experience derails the subjugated population from its natural projected historical cause, resulting in a legacy of physical, psychological, social, and economic disparities that persist across generations. And I think what really that comes into is that moment, for me, that act of resistance really challenged the idea of the Rainbow Nation, right? And the idea of living post-apartheid. And like there's this thing about post-apartheid or Rainbow Nation that sends out that lulling insinuation that we live in an era that's now completely gotten rid of elements of colonialism or elements of apartheid, in the society. But then, if you understand what colonialism, you'd understand that apartheid was essentially an extension of colonialism, right? And I think it's important for us to actually define the current disposition that we're currently living in right now, right? And I think for me, what really Nkrumah explains as, or rather defines as neocolonialism, would rightly sort of define what's happening and what the current disposition that we're finding ourselves in. And obviously, quoting Nkrumah, he defines neocolonialism as, he says that the essence of neocolonialism, right, is that the state which is subject to it is in theory independent and sort of free from all the trappings of international all the international power, but then in reality, its economic system and thus its internal policy is directed from outside. And I think this also speaks to the idea of having, rating agencies and understanding who the economy is still, who controls the economy. And if we look at it, majority of the economy of the country is still in the hands of the white minority. And those are the people that essentially have the power, right? And have the overall hegemony when we speak about that, right? And so for me, what Fees Must Fall did was to say, but then listen, we're living in a state that does not necessarily help Black people, or that does not necessarily, and we are being introduced into these institutions like universities that were not necessarily built with Black people in mind, right? And so it's some sort of, we are just being integrated into institutions that were built to oppress us, essentially, right? And if you look at the history of Rao, for instance, UJ, for instance, right? And I think for me, what Fees Must Fall did was that we can't speak of Rainbow Nation, or we can't speak of post-apartheid if we did not have an era of decolonization. And so we can't speak of living in a post as though, post, it's like after, as though there's nothing there aren't any elements that are left of oppression that we experienced during apartheid, that we experienced during colonialism. So it's important for us to actually say, we need to actually say that what we are currently facing right now is neocolonialism, and what can we use, or what is the counter solution, I suppose, to this problem that we're finding ourselves in. And decolonization is exactly that. And that's what Fees Must Fall and the Forest movement was saying, that outside of the decommodification of education, outside of wanting to open up education to black people, right? But then that very education still needs to speak to us. And what this idea of Rainbow Nation and post-apartheid did was that it gifted the white youth with the liberty to recreate themselves, recreate themselves anew from the historical past. Whereas what it did to us as blacks is that it burdened us with having to go back home and think about the basics of life. So we don't have time, and we don't have the liberty to actually think about how do we recreate, how do we rethink or reimagine a new society that will speak to us. What we do instead is to think about the basics of food, the basics of how do I access education, how do I go about or navigate going from one place to another place, getting taxi and buses that are overcrowded, right? And it does something to us psychologically. So a lot of people don't necessarily want to speak about the psychological effect that we've experienced as the youth of this country, right? And a lot of times it's always like, oh no, we have to speak about it as no, it's something that happened then, so we're moving forward. No, like just forget about it, like just move on, But we don't necessarily want to speak about those things, and that's where I have troubles with. Like that's the whole idea of how, okay, so poverty, crime, unemployment, all those things are a result of the history of this country, if we look at it, right? And we look at the fact that because we are in need of the basics of life, that's how crime just it just grows in this country. Because black people, what we are worried about is the next meal. And what do we do to do that is crime, And we can't speak about that without actually really going back and looking into that. And I think what Fees Must Fall did was to essentially challenge us to have those kind of conversations, those difficult conversations about what is it that we are finding ourselves in. What is this thing? How do we define this problem that's going on? How is it that we have normalized living in a shack for black people, but it's a huge deal for white people to live in a shack? Why is it that the majority of the country, which is black, are still still live in dire conditions, right? In inhumane conditions? And I think that's what Fees Must Fall for me did, and that's what the Forest movement did, to begin to have this conversation. And I don't think that we have failed in any way to actually to push the narrative forward, right? And I think I do agree with both Busi and Dogos. I just wanted to put that a different perspective into it, into saying that the decolonial project, we wanted that. That was the fundamental basis of the Forest movement. Decolonization and understanding where we are at as blacks, and I think that's what Fees Must Fall did. It forces us to do that, and I think if in any case, I think we have achieved that objective, to say people must begin to have really difficult conversations. So yeah.
Thank you. All right, as it sits in terms of our time checks, Ntokozo has got 30 seconds to rebut, should he choose to. Busi's the only one with her 3 minutes still remaining. Punzani's got 2 minutes, 30 seconds, and Asanda, you've got 1 minute. I'm doing this because I'm trying to make the playing field as equal as possible in terms of our panelists getting an opportunity to say something. Now, Busi, you wanted to respond to Asanda's comments. Right after we've suspended all of the panelists 10 minutes, we're going to open it up to the floor, yeah? So, Busi?
So, Ntokozo, you say something that I find very problematic. And the reason why I find it problematic is because it insinuates the fact that we as Folists are in the same place as everyone else who should be a Folist. It's the same way of saying, oh, women should be feminists. But what I find particularly very problematic is you speaking about the disgruntlement amongst black people. What disgruntlement? There is no disgruntlement from my perspective around black people, right? And the reason why I say this, it ties back to me calling Fees Must Fall a moment, is because Fees Must Fall also becomes a test to some degree, right? A test to see who in society and to what extent society is going to actually wake up and realize that we're all in this mess together. And when I say we, I mean black people as we. right? Those who choose to define themselves as black, great. But essentially, there's no disgruntlement amongst black people. I mean, Lauryn Hill says this in a beautiful song titled Black Rage, right? When there is disgruntlement amongst black people, you have a situation like what we had leading up to 1994. You have a situation where the country comes to a standstill, especially looking at the fact that we are the majority population in the country. So Fees Must Fall for me becomes a test to see if black people are disgruntled, to see if black people are woke, because I mean in these Fallers spaces we like to use the word woke a lot, to see if black people realize and are awake to their reality. Because to a large extent, I believe what Fanon says when he says, more than anything, it seems as though the black individual wants to take the place of the white master, right? In the sense that we don't really want liberation, we don't really want freedom, we just want what white people have.
Yeah.
That's what we want, actually. So Fees Must Fall for me, because when we started the Fallist movement, I remember we continuously said we want free education now, in our lifetime, and then we're coming for the land, right? Because that's always been the narrative around fallism, to say we need to be able to move from one milestone to another. Because what free education affords us is it affords us the opportunity to be able to conscientize our masses, to conscientize the people. We assumed that if everyone was able to get free education, and this is why we want free education for all, we would be able to deal with the psychology of black individuals in a place that they all go to, which is a classroom. So what does Fees Must Fall do? So Fees Must Fall then, to some extent, inspires the Minister of Basic Education to introduce history as a compulsory subject only from grade 10 till 12. That's very problematic because the only history those grade 10s till 12 are going to get is a colonial history. And it's going to be a history that assumes we only came into existence, we dropped from the sky somewhere when colonialism started, when history should be taught from grade 1, right? It should be taught from early childhood development. So for you to be saying that there's disgruntlement amongst black people, please show me where those blacks are. Those are the ones I'm trying to get to. I'm looking for those ones. I'm trying to do the work of getting black people upset, of getting them into a state of rage, because we need the liberation. As Funzani had said, and as you had said also as well, Ntokozo, 1994 was a distraction, and we fell for it. We're still falling for it today. Ask me where the youth are right now, June 16. They can't tell you what happened at Sharpeville. They can't tell you anything about this day outside of the fact that we're commemorating. There are cooler boxes being loaded right now. Parks are filled with young people living their best lives, or living the lives that white people are living, assuming that they are free. So if you can show me, my brother, where these disgruntled blacks are, I'm looking for them. Jabafuna. I want them.
I think there is disgruntlement. And I think actually as Fallists, we need to do that work of going into communities and working with communities and actually mobilizing those disgruntlements. I don't think that in my township where I am from, that there isn't disgruntlement. People are always protesting about different issues in the community. I think it is actually problematic when we as I'll come back to this point, but essentially I do think there is disgruntlement in black communities, but we need to mobilize. We haven't mobilized. We need to continue to reach out to black communities and to mobilize on the issues that they're facing.
Okay, thank you, Ndozo. This is now the time where we open the conversation up to the audience. I saw a hand in that general area earlier on, someone wanting to comment. Are you still there? I think we've all heard what the panel has to say. I think there are a number of themes that have come out from our panel in terms of the Fallist movement, the differentiation between the Fallist movement and Rose Must Fall and Fees Must Fall. And also I think a big theme that's come out for me is a conversation around the black condition in this country, and about how the Fallist movement was trying to conscientize not just students around it, but their greater communities and the society and the country in general, in terms of moving public discourse towards a certain kind of understanding of where black people are. Does anyone have a comment or a question?
In today's world, we have countries, like they have laws that are against racism, but does it really affect racism in society? Because you have white people, I'm not saying all white people, because I believe black people can also be racist, But I believe that these laws that are put in place do not really stop racism, because you have small comments like saying black people should sing a thank you to someone. You know, that's actually a very racist comment, because it's not in our culture to always sing a thank you. Like say, oh, we sing to our parents when we say thank you. That's not, and to also think that because you learn a few things about us, you immediately know everything about us. And to think that Africa as a continent is just one thing, one culture, it isn't. Because you have South Africans, you have Kenyans, you have Nigerians, you have different people, and they all have different cultures. So I think that people, like black people, should stop believing that white people, because we have these laws and because they're trying to act as friends to us, we should not fall for the window dressing and believe that they actually are not racist and whatever happened in the past are actually in the past. Because some people are still living like that. They're still carrying these things on, and it's actually stupid for us to actually think that, okay, they are being friends to us. Because there are some people who are being friends, but we also need to be intelligent enough to differentiate our friends from our supposed friends.
I think for me, I think we have to understand how race was essentially like a social construct, right? And how it was used to justify the oppression, like to justify the oppression that was the oppression of blacks, essentially. So I think understanding how that then came into being, right, is to sort of like understand how racism and colonialism cannot necessarily be separated. I think we'll speak a bit more about race. But I just wanted to actually even answer on what it means to be black, because I think for me, what it actually means in this current moment, and I'm deliberate when I call black people blacks, because I feel like it has to have that kind of meaning of saying, or a reminder of saying that we are still blacks, and so therefore there's still work that needs to be done. There's still work that we still need to continue with the struggle. So to be black for me means resistance, you know, and it means that there is still work that needs to be done to get to a point where we actually do not even necessarily need to call ourselves blacks, you know. But I think it just highlights on that. It highlights on the fact that there's a need for us to still continue with the struggle, and it reminds us of our blackness and our black condition, and that there's still some work that needs to be done with that regards. I think Vusi will contribute a bit on that.
I was like very hesitant to answer that because we must do the work of teaching and getting people to unlearn certain things. One of the first fundamental basics is black people can't be racist. Not in our current setting, not in our current society. I don't think it will be possible even in future for us to be racist. This is obviously a conversation I would definitely love to have with you one-on-one, because I want to walk you down the road of what it means to be racist, how racism expresses itself, and as Lunzani says, it can't be exclusive to colonialism, right? And the fact that I'm scared for you, because to some extent you think that there are white people who want to be our friends. They aren't, my baby, I'm sorry. And the reason why I say this, and an example of this is, Biko makes an example of this when he, during the COSAS days, when he's still at Rhodes University, and he says, any white person that wants to stand with us must essentially stand before us first and form a barrier. So when the police want to shoot at us, they'll first have to go through the white people. I can assure you those white people will not be there. The white people in our movement in Fees Must Fall were there to a certain extent, right? And we must also think about what the involvement of white people means in movements such as Fees Must Fall and in other movements as well, because to a large extent they seem to be allies and they appear as allies and they're willing to put their bodies on the line, yes, but obviously they have more to gain from that than we do. I mean, if I were to bring up one of the white people that was with us in the movement, he would become essentially a hero of some kind, right? Not only to the white community, but also to the black community, because we're always looking for a white god somewhere in our spaces, in our movements.
Sure.
So, yes, this is work I'd definitely love to do with you. I hope we'll be able to have this conversation after. But I also want to respond to the movement didn't fail, but society did. I mean, I can agree with that to some extent, right? So I'll speak specifically about the Wits Fees Must Fall movement. When I was mobilizing, and I think it will also answer the question, the lessons around mobilization, quickly.
Yeah.
So when I was mobilizing, a lot of the groups that we mobilized were lawyers, they were doctors to assist those who would be medically injured, they were unionists. There was a particular point in time where everyone was seeing Vavi all over Wits running around. I mean, people from different spaces were involved in Fees Must Fall, have written about Fees Must Fall, and they've put them in their bios now to say, I was a Fees Must Fall activist, because it's a good thing. But where is Nukai Toby? Nukai Toby was Advocate Mukai Toby was at the Fees Must Fall movement at Wits University and at other institutions. So was Advocate Dalim Pofu. How essentially is Kanya still in prison when we already had those lawyers who were in the Fees Must Fall movement as activists, as fallers? How do we have a situation where the legal system is able to do what it is doing to us and they are not responding at all, right? Because we knew that we would need lawyers, because people like me go head in first, we think later, which means I'm obviously going to get into trouble with the law because the law is rejecting me essentially. But where are those people? They are willing to put these things in their bios and say, you know, Fees Must Fall 2015, me, I was there. Nukai Toby even has a chapter about it in his book about land, but where Kanya is still in jail. So for me, I would like to say society did fail, but more than anything, the movement, particularly the individuals in the movement that were there specifically to have us avoid all these inconveniences, have failed. So I'm coming from that perspective.
Black people cannot be racist, but they can, however, display internalized racism, which is when you've listened and heard the messages of racism so much that you internalize them and you start laughing at your friend that's speaking English and they're breaking it a little bit. That's a sign of internalized racism. But black people, as she said, can never be racist. And then there was a question around Panyaza Lesotho going around fighting for the inclusion of kids at the schools. I always find it fascinating that whenever we have these debates, we always end up at this kind of debate. So our constitution says, South Africa belongs to all who live in it. What that means is, if I want to decide tomorrow I'm leaving Cape Town, I'm going to live in Limpopo, Venda, my child must have a space there. And if the next day I decide, actually, I think the Northern Cape is better, my child must have a space there. And if I decide to move to yet another place, anywhere in this here country, our children should have a space at every school, in every language. So I think it's very important for us to understand that the fight for the inclusion of South African children in essentially South African schools, because those are not white schools, those are South African schools. And black people, even during apartheid, were paying tax. And black people, even during apartheid, even though we're not earning enough at times to pay tax, we were paying tax in other ways. So those schools belong as much to us as they do to the white people in the suburbs who live in those suburbs and who think they belong to them. And so I think we need to be very clear about the fact that we all belong there and we should be fighting to be included in those spaces and to own those spaces, not just be included in those spaces. And then the second thing I wanted to address particularly to that is, yes, it's actually possible to both build beautiful, amazing schools in Soweto while also fighting for inclusion in Sandton. The two are not mutually exclusive. Both can be done. And then I just also want to go, there was a conversation around mobilization and some of the lessons. I think that for me, in terms of the future, as I spoke to the importance of developing student capacity to be co-creators of the curriculum, but one of the other biggest things that I think is going to be very important in the future is for us to have a conversation about language. The fact that I'm sitting in a group of majority Africans and I'm having to articulate myself in English, it speaks to the colonial nature of South African structures, even when we try to decolonize. I lecture at an institution that is majority black, and I have to lecture in English. And that inherently makes the space a white space, because English is not the language of black people. And so we need to think about how do we move and how do we develop a language, or how do we appreciate our languages more, such that everyone here can speak their native tongue and do it in such a way that everyone here can also understand what's being said. And I think that also on the sense of language, we also need to dig a little bit deeper and not just talk about it from a language English perspective, but also in terms of what kind of language do we use. When we talk about decolonization, we should not be using textbook or book language. We should be speaking a language that somebody in a rural part of South Africa, somebody in a township, somebody in any part of South Africa should be able to understand. And if we're going to talk about intersectionality, for instance, when we talk about even something like feminism, we need to do it in a way that understands that feminism did not arrive in South Africa with books that white people are now selling us. Feminism has always been there. South African societies are matriarchal because we understand feminism and it is actually in our core. And so I think part of the problem is that you will ask what is decolonization because your conceptual understanding of decolonization is based on us talking about it from a textbook perspective. Decolonization is what we do as Africans when we live our lives in the most natural way of being. That's decolonization.
I just want to speak to, like, I think there's one question that I think I can combine. There are two questions that I think I can combine into one. So the one about assimilation, the question about whether we should be fighting for our children to get into the sentence and to get into those schools that are located in white areas. One of the things that colonialism does very well is to convince us that there is a white world in a settler colony. There isn't. All of it belongs to us. Okay? It was built by African resources, African labor. It was built, we built these buildings, we built these schools, we built these institutions. So why must we shy away from them? There needs to be a total takeover. And this is what decolonization means, actually. Decolonization means the total reorganizing of society. So it means the undermining of the bifurcation between the black world in the townships, where blacks are dying each minute, and your Sandton. The person in Alex who can literally walk into Sandton, into a school, is forced not to enter there because, well, it's a white institution. Where? In our land. So I think this is the kind of conversation we need to be having. We need to move away from thinking of any institution as a white institution. There is no white institution in a settler colony. It's an acclaimed white institution, but all of it is ours. And actually, to conclude, and Africa, I'm glad that you touched on this point, because it's not just settler colonies, but it's also in the metropole, where our resources were exiting and going to the Britons of this world, to the French of this world. Those institutions are ours. Those ones, they are ours. And we want, either they must pay us, we want the money, or, decolonization, and this is really what we need to understand. Everything must become black, because everything has been constructed through black suffering. And throughout the world. So we are going to take it over. And as I say, it is actually a travesty that when we have these conversations, we have to explain ourselves so much. And I think, this is where the fallists then come in, where they say, no, it's time for action. It's time for the person in Guamash, for you, to understand decolonization through their material conditions. Because bona, they're not here, they won't open Fanon. But they understand that there's something wrong with where they are. And you need to fight with them. You need to say, yes, I've got this knowledge as a university student, but what are the material conditions that affect our people? And how do we articulate the decolonial project through those conditions? And then it can move as a black nation. Thank you.
Just quickly in terms of mobilization. And the one thing that I've learned about mobilizing, especially in communities, is that it is so difficult to mobilize people who are essentially hungry, because the basics of it is that, look, you want me to come into a meeting, but there's no food. I have no food in my house, first off, and I need to actually travel to come to that meeting. So it becomes very difficult to then say, okay, just come through, and not necessarily say, this is how this meeting is going to help you, or this is what the objective of the meeting is, in terms of in relation to them themselves, and what they're going to benefit from it. So it's very difficult to mobilize communities in that sense, and I think that's one thing that we actually need to recognize whenever we mobilize communities, that there's that those basic needs that needs to be covered first. If you're going to say people must come to a meeting or people must gather together, then you must provide transport money, for instance, or you must also tell them that there is going to be food, or like how is, but also the discourse as well is kind of gets a bit difficult, in a sense that we are so used to university settings where it's me, Busi, and Togoz, and a couple of other comrades where I can, articulate myself and speak about patriarchy and speak about misogyny in a way that they already understand those names, right? And I think one of the things that it really decolonization is about, in the forest movement is finding that language that speaks to the people, right? And that actually that people can relate to as well, and speaking about the bread and butter issues usually is so important, because people can easily connect with you and can easily then want to have that conversation with you in a more effective way, and in ways that we can actually come up with solutions that are practical to them, So mobilization is so difficult in communities in comparison to universities. I mean, I was at UJ, and UJ, the main problem that we had was the militarization of the university. Like, it was literally militarized through and through. We were threatened with rape by bouncers, and we were followed to the toilets by bouncers, like men, big men. I mean, there were times where students would come to us and say, but these bouncers are not necessarily helping us, but they were there. So, there was a point where I was taken out of the university premises because I speak too much, or I talk too much, or whatever the case may be. So there was just the difference between, community mobilization and university mobilization. But what is fundamentally the same is that people want you to speak to the bread and butter issues, and then connect it to, obviously, the whole complication of how, or the intricacies of how oppression has played itself out and got us to this position that we are currently in. But yeah, that's
I'm going to take the second round of questions shortly, but what I find interesting is, as has been critiqued, we're here to have a conversation around the role that the forest movement played, right? And one of the themes that keeps on rising to the fore is around the Black condition, is around articulating not just the material conditions of Black people in this country, but also the psychological effects of generational trauma, etc., and the continued conditions that Black people find themselves under. And yet the movement that we're discussing happened in a very specific space, which are university campuses, which are essentially spaces of privilege. So yes, while we can agree that Black and brown bodies within those spaces face a certain kind of oppression, the space that they're in, the fact that those brown bodies made it there, means that they hold a certain kind of privilege. They hold the privilege of language, as Asanda has said, in terms of academic language. I mean, when I first started in speaking to the Fawless as a journalist, I had to sort of wrap my head around some of the language that they were using. Language like pedagogy. I don't even know if I'm still saying that word right. Is it pedagogy or pedagogy? Do you understand? So those kinds of things that create a bigger gap. And I'm someone with a university education. And as the gentleman said there, I'm glad that ukhulume ngokwamashu, Baba, because that's where I'm from. Kwamashu, ne? What did the Fawless movement, beyond what happened in the news headlines, what did it actually mean to people who are outside the university space, who can't even access that space, not only because of money and fees, but also because of the brokenness of our basic education system, or because they don't want to be in a university space in any case. They want to do different things with their lives, right? And so I want us to think about whether the Fawless construction or construction or manifestation of decolonization and the conversation around it truly does speak to the black condition? Does it speak to a black condition outside of the urban, multi-racial, I'm sorry to say, coconut space? Does it really? Does it speak to our grandmothers, our family members that are unable to access that space for whatever reason or are not in that space for whatever reason? Does decolonization, in the way that it manifests itself, in the way that it's been structured at the present moment, speak to the black condition in its entirety, right? And if perhaps it doesn't, does it have to? Is it okay to have certain conversations within the spaces where they belong? I don't know if I'm making sense. Is it okay for urban black youth to have a specific kind of conversation amongst themselves, and perhaps township black youth have a different conversation, then those conversations are joined together? So those are just some of the things that I'm wanting you to think about.
The question that I really wanted to ask was that around the fees must fall issue, we're going to have free education. Let's take the example. We have free education, but then we don't have quality education for the free education that we want. People are always going to London, going to Paris to get quality education. It's like very rare to see people say that I'm from South Africa and I'm proud of the certificate I'm holding. But then yet when they go to London, they say, no, I've got this and I went to London and I got that. Why don't we first start with our quality education from here first, then work on saying that, no, we need fees must fall. So I would say that too.
Hi guys, thank you so much. Just quickly on the Flawless movement, this is to all the panelists, especially Funzani, Busi and Dogozo. One thing that I think we didn't take into account as a strong ally is the socio-psycho effects of the project of decolonization. I mean, if you look at what we're trying to say to people, it's kind of synonymous with the symptoms of depression. We're saying, as a black person, you're oppressed, you are in a worthless state, and we saw it, right? Mental illness was a huge consequence that we didn't prepare for. So if we're going to carry on with this, and we know the status quo swallowed it up, you know? People got conscientized, people wanted to fight, and they lost. That added to actually what it takes if you internalize all the things that we talk about here about the black condition. So if we're going to mobilize further, if we're going to carry on with this project, and we know the mental exhaustion that many people have with it, what kind of spaces are we going to create that safety of socio-psycho safety for people? And even outside of just the psychological, Flawless now who are struggling to find jobs, when you're woke in the boardroom, it doesn't make your working experience very well. There are many allies who suffered by supporting the Flawless movement in their boardrooms because the status quo works like that. So I think there's a responsibility we must take when it comes to that shortcoming, and a reimagining we must take forward when going forward, that if I want to make her woke, I need to be responsible for what that's going to mean in her fighting against something as powerful and as hurtful as the status quo.
If ever our student leaders are not with us as the youth, what have we done? Then which means the mobilization part was not properly done. When I say the mobilization part, it means that grassroots mobilization, meaning that from grade R until university level, that's where we were supposed to start. And if we want something, we have to stand up and say, we want it. We are not asking, but we want it. That's where we were supposed to start. Because if we remember very well from my panelist day, that what happened during the Fees Must Fall, we were told that, guys, relax, we are in discussion, go back to school, go and write your exams, then we will carry on with the discussions. How can I carry on while some of us are not here?
Yeah, I think the space is an important space for us to start these conversations and to have these conversations in the first place. So I think in that vein, like the platforms that you are holding as panelists is very important. And yeah, I think I'm just struggling to understand, Busisiwe, your points when you say that you think what Ntokozo said about black people being disgruntled is problematic, because I just can't understand how you wouldn't see that black people are disgruntled. You know, black people are protesting every single day in South Africa. I think that's a sign of being disgruntled. I think that's a sign of being angry and being tired of the way that things have been going on. So I don't think black people, disgruntled black people, are waiting for Ntokozo to tell Ubusisiwe that we are disgruntled, so she must come and mobilize us. People are protesting right now. Thank you.
Black people, we are in a uncomfortable, comfortable situation. on every day, whenever we go to townships, we are reminded of our incompleteness as black people. I mean, on a daily basis, we have situations whereby, as a black person, I have to stand in a queue, going to spend almost like close to 45 minutes, if not 1 hour, to get to my place of workplace. That's number one. Sorry, Sam. That's number one. We are sardines into trains, for an example. Why is the government telling us that no, they're coming with food parcel on a daily basis? When I go to universities, I had to explain myself to NASFAS on every day. I do not have money. I'm not intending to have money. The notion of NSFAS in its own is problematic for black people. On every year, we have to explain that I don't have money. So even the issue of fees is not something that we subscribe to. Black people, we don't have money. We are going to spaces of institutions to demand education, and we demand it by force. So it has to be like that. It has to be very clear like that. So we have to move into spaces where, as black people, there is activism amongst ourselves. Let us go back to our spaces as black people, write and go to oral history, you know, and learn about the untold history. For an example, about June 16. The untold history about June 16. Where does this come from?
Thank you, everybody, for your input. So I'm a teacher, and my concern is really about my students. So for me, I was teaching in a township school when this happened. And for me, my expectation was that it would translate into really a revolution in our education system. Because it's the truth. It's only, not even 10% that make up the privilege that ends up sitting in front of us, privilege that is in university. And so for me, the movement failed because it didn't bring the revolution that I had hoped for as an educator. And I know that the conversation amongst educators was, finally, young people are fighting for something that matters. Not only do they want a free education, but the truth is that if the free education is like what has happened in the schools, I wouldn't want my children to go to that university, if I'm honest, because the quality drops every single time, at least in this country, when it's free. So that's my first question. My second question is, what can be done to conscientize younger people about the importance of staying relevant? Because for them, they have access to this if they go to good schools and, you know, that whole Santon thing. So what can I as an educator do within the confines of the curriculum and my limitations to make them consciously aware of what it means to be decolonized and racism and all these things? I'd really love your input.
Yes, I'll let Asanda, because she also is works as an educator. But I would like to challenge you first, and everyone in the audience, that as much as I believe that the conversation we're having today is important, I do think that I would like to rather caution us against placing all of the responsibility on the Fallist movement and on the Fallists, right? There is obviously a debate to be had about whether or not they achieved the aims for which they set out. But I don't think that it is wise for us as South Africans, as a citizenry, to place at their feet, right, the role to decolonize the entire education system. That's not what they set out to do. They never said that was what they were going to do. And even if they had, I don't think that it is fair to play, because then what that does is absolves the rest of us, right, of any responsibility of the current conditions that perpetuate in the different spaces that we're in. So I would say
and I know I'm not a panelist, but to respond to you, I would say, and I'm not supposed to express an opinion, I think I've done well. I would say that as an educator, these three, well, she is, are not educators. You're an educator with an understanding of what decolonization is supposed to mean to you. So you need to begin to think about how you teach that curriculum. What you speak to, but what you speak to the children about. What I'm trying to say is, I don't know that, I'm sure they will give you an answer if they have one, but I don't know that it's fair to say that their movement didn't reach your space, right? And then go on to ask them how you can improve your space. I don't know if I'm making sense, but I'll stop there.
Okay, I think I was going to say a little bit of what you said. I'm really happy that the majority of the people said we. Because I think it's important for us to understand that decolonization is not the responsibility, as she said, of the three people who were part of the movement. I myself was not a student at the time of Fees Must Fall. I was not a student at the time of Roads Must Fall. But I took it upon myself as a lecturer at the time to decide what my role was going to be. I did not sit and have conversations with these students to say, guys, what's my role as a lecturer? I listened to what they were saying, and what they were calling for was a decolonized curriculum. And I said, well, I have the power as a lecturer to decolonize the curriculum that I currently teach. And so that's what I did. And then when I was done with my own curriculum, I said, well, maybe there are others who need help. Maybe there are others who need support to be able to deal with the challenges that one then faces when they try and deconstruct the status quo, as Xoli said. And so I then took it upon myself to work with some of my colleagues, and we started the Decolonizing the Curriculum movement at my institution. And so I think there's a lot of questioning about how do we do this, how do we do this? And I think, amandla gawethu, which means the power is ours. It is our responsibility as South African citizens to decolonize in the same way that I don't think Mandela stood and said, I'll only go to prison if everyone else goes to prison with me. It's a collective responsibility. And I think as a teacher, I really must say I'm disappointed that you expected young people to deal with such a huge issue that has failed so many people. I think it's your role as a teacher to see what in your school you can decolonize, and to see what in your environment as a whole you can decolonize. And I think there's also, and I'm sorry I'm taking time, but I'm very particular about this idea, and it's been said more than once that free equals less quality. That's not true. Not everything that is free is of a lesser quality. And even this idea that going to London must mean that South African education is of a lower quality. No. Africans have been traveling to all over the world long before even colonization started. We were going all over the world to try and understand how others live so that we can understand ourselves better, and so that we can see what the bits and pieces that we can take. And so decolonization is about understanding our place and our context in the world. And it's about taking responsibility at an individual level for the process of decolonization. It's about taking responsibility at a community level for the process of decolonization. So the question I will throw back, and I was writing, as people were asking question, who are decolonizers? It's you. Whose responsibility is it to decolonize? It's you. What is the role in the space of children? You are parents. Decolonize your own children.
Yes.
And I mean, just on the last thing about quality, which I didn't finish, is that just because it's important for us to understand that as South Africa, we actually suffer from a depression, which you spoke of. And one of the things that we suffer from is an inferiority complex, in which we cannot differentiate between elements of our education system that are failing and elements of our education that are working and need to be improved. This idea that our whole entire education system is it's irreparable is highly problematic, because if it really was such a failure, how did it result in the 4 minds that are sitting here and have been able to critically analyze and question the very system that they come out of?
Particularly around teachers. I think this also ties into mobilization. This also ties into lessons learned. For me, I expected that when we had started the Fees Must Fall movement and when we were engaged in the Fees Must Fall movement, that those educators that believed in the movement would have started it in their schools themselves. They would have been there first thing in the morning, closing gates, saying, no one is going to school today because fees must fall, free education. These learners are going to go into institutions that can't capacitate them, they don't have access, accommodation is land, and all these things. So I had expected that through the work that we were doing, it would inspire you as an educator to do more. So that's what I had expected. And this also covers why we weren't able to go into other areas, but we kept it at institutions of higher learning, because that's where we had access, right? And outside of us having access to those institutions, that's where we had identified the problem to begin with. That's when our eyes were open. So it became the only avenue and the only space that we could utilize in order to get the message we wanted across. Now, with that being said, and I understand the need to mobilize children and to go into early childhood development, but my sister Xoli makes a very important, and she raises a very important question when she speaks about the social, psychological implications of fees must fall. And this is something that we haven't spoken about. The fact that we've had comrades who've had mental breakdowns. We've had comrades who've committed suicide. We've had comrades who have left institutions of higher learning and just want to sit at home and do absolutely nothing with their lives and just drift off into nothing land, right? So those implications prevent us from involving children because of the nature and the response that we were getting from the state. I mean, when we had just begun doing the shutdown, I think that's when the stun grenades came, rubber bullets, bouncers, as Funzani had said, and that is not an environment that we would like to have young children in. We appreciate the support, and the support obviously can come from and in a different manner, but it is not something that necessitates the involvement or the physical involvement of young people because of the sociological and psychological implications of fees must fall. And when Xoli asked the question, what do we then do moving forward, looking at the social political issues, looking at the fact that our comrades have broken down, looking at the fact that many have committed suicide, it becomes a conversation that we must have collectively with the general public, with society as well. Because to a large extent, we were being ignored because these very cameras that you see here around us were perpetuating a propaganda that wasn't essentially true. So we were painted as villains, as hooligans, as all these things by the media, and it didn't assist our narrative. So even if we wanted to mobilize other communities, we weren't going to be able to, because the fees must fall. You were seeing on TV only burnt libraries, only burnt buildings. It was burning police cars. It wasn't a fees must fall that is true to the nature of what we are attempting to do. And outside of that, we're not done, guys. We can't be done. I mean, fees must fall, like I said, and I will continue to say, was a moment that must be extended. So when Xoli asks, how do we then deal with, the psychological implications, we're going to need the assistance of society. We're going to need the assistance of trained professionals to help us, deal with the psychological implications. As I'd mentioned earlier, going into fees must fall, we had a lot of allies that we had rallied around us. Another ally that we now need to get on board are psychologists and therapists. Now they must come with us to the ground so that they understand why we're having a breakdown, why we're throwing ourselves across buildings and so forth. So this is the work that we still need to do. And June 16, particularly this event, becomes an instrument and it becomes a tool that we can and should use to get the third wave of fees must fall over. I mean, they said there's free education. People still can't access that free education. People's historical debt has not been paid. Accommodation is a crisis. People are still sleeping in libraries. We've basically only just achieved a pronouncement and not free education. We haven't decolonized. And for me, decolonization means rejecting modernity. And by rejecting modernity, as Black people across the continent of Africa, we modernized the world. we set the trend for the world, how the world works and how the world has continued to work. And for me, a rejection of modernity would be us creating a new Africa, a new sense of identity for ourselves, a new curriculum, and that's where decolonization is centered for me. We need to stop reimagining things. We've got work to do. We need to go back to the ground. My people are in jail. Ukanya's not arrested for 8 years for me to be sitting on this panel and talking about whether we failed or not. Mine is just to say we've got work to do, and I hope you'll join us this time.
So I think for me, I just wanted to go into like the whole idea of quality education. And whenever people speak about quality education, it always seems like they sort of want it to still be in a very colonized way. Because I don't think we can speak about quality education as long as the kind of education that we are consuming does not necessarily speak to us and does not help us to produce solutions that can address societal ills that we are currently facing, and that does not help us to understand the land question, and that does not necessarily help us to understand our oppression as a people, then that education is useless, right? Because it does not necessarily speak to the conditions of our people. What it does is that it continuously produces people that can be exploited, rather, right? And not necessarily people that can think for themselves. And it tells us what to think, and not necessarily teaches us how to think and how to actually find solutions. And that's part of the reason why we are still finding ourselves in these positions, right? And I think I wanted to sort of like go into the whole idea of also incorporating children and into, or rather, making them understand what is going on. But I think one of the ways that we can actually do so of sort of like introducing children into a decolonized society is to actually us ourselves unlearn toxic things that we have internalized through colonialism, through apartheid. And there's so many things, like for instance, patriarchy, guys, like there's so many things that we have actually learned that are very toxic that we teach to our children. How do we, I don't think the role of children in this whole thing is to actually understand the whole complexities of decolonization, the whole complexities of our oppression, but to rather unlearn and teach them a different kind of way of living, of interacting with other people, of seeing the world, right? And as I said earlier, that's the thing that we have been robbed of, especially as young black people, because the foundation and like literally the basic of our thinking is on what is next, how am I going to get by next, rather than actually thinking about recreating ourselves and recreating our society. So it becomes very important for us not to only have a conversation about, oh, this is what happened to us, but how do we move forward from here, and how do we do so constructively in ways that we do not necessarily teach our children toxic ways of being, of interacting, of just living, right? And I think this is where the role of parents come in. As parents, I'm not a parent, but I have sisters. But as parents, I think it's very important to then recognize what is it that is toxic that we have actually internalized, right? That we are teaching to our kids. There are certain things that we know that these things aren't necessarily to be there. Like, we can't continuously be responding to people, women dying in the country. We can't continuously be responding to rape culture. But rather, we actually need to go to the core of why are those things even existing to begin with. And it literally starts with us and unlearning toxic ways of interacting, unlearning all of those things. And I think this is where children then can come in, having to teach children to interact in a different way than how we've been interacting the entire time.
Okay, so mine is going to be slightly different. I mean, I see that we are kind of moving swiftly along. It is 16 minutes past. And I had sort of noted that you had wanted the advocate to sort of make concluding remarks. I personally would feel very uncomfortable with the advocate having the last word. So I think we should, no, just in a sense that, you know, like this is a fullest panel. Like we can't a conclusion from like a white
Doris,
man.
I think you
understand.
misunderstand. The advocate is going to have closing remarks from the audience. The final remarks will come from the panel.
Oh, is it? Okay,
Yes.
cool. No, I just wanted to clarify
Yes.
because we are
So
not about to have
in terms of the audience response.
Yes. No. We won't have a flawless panel that is sort of concluded in that voice. And it's, and this is the thing that people misunderstood. It's not us being rude, but it's us saying that we need to be at the center as black people and that our voice needs to be the final one because we are masters of our own destiny. And I think going forward, actually, I do appreciate that, yes, the rest of society has a role to play. Yes, teachers must decolonize by themselves. They must come up with ways of doing things. But I think it is important to organize ourselves collectively as a black collective. And this is why we are inspired by the Black Consciousness Movement, because this is what it teaches us. It says, as blacks, our power comes from our collective organization. So we need to actually not see the teacher's point as necessarily being an attack. It is important for us to, get in touch with those people that want to decolonize. It is important to us to, for us to reach out into communities. It is important for us to, in every sector of South African society, kumele decolonize. And for that decolonization to happen, there is work to be done. And I feel like if we take a very campusist approach that limits us to campuses and that limits our work to campuses, we will forever be faced with the problem that we are not really touching the core. And the core is that black people as a nation are oppressed and that black people as a nation need to be liberated. So, going forward, let's create those links. I would love to get your details. I would love for us to do programs. And it is, we can't keep on having these panels each and every 16 June and nothing comes out of it. There have to be programs. One of the inspirational movements that we look up to is the Black Panther movement in the USA. And what the Black Panther movement did is that it had community programs. It was a revolutionary organization. It had, a revolutionary mandate. It was preaching black liberation politics. But it understood, right, that you preach those politics, but you integrate that with the broader black community, that you have we need black centers of excellence that are examples in townships that we've established. I need a flawless school. Graduates of the fullest, because that is what it's about. It's about creating, it's about reshaping our existence, it's about reshaping our institutions, it's about reshaping our entire identity and how we know ourselves as a people. So programs. Thank you.
Thank you. All right. What we're going to do now is I'm going to take two more, I think, comments from the floor, and then Advocate Bezos to close off the audience commentary, and then take closing statements from the panel. Asanda does need to go, though, but before you leave, I would like to give Asanda an opportunity just to give her closing remarks before we open up to the last round of audience comments.
We need to take this decolonization project on as a project for us, by us. And every single person needs to think about how they can decolonize. I mean, I always joke that, Julius Malema once said, be a Julius where you are. So be a decolonizer where you are, whatever that means for you. And obviously do create those links and do speak to those who have come before and who might have a little bit of knowledge. But what I also find is that in South Africa, we suffer from, I said before, an inferiority complex, but we also suffer from a sort of, what do they call those things that they put on horses again? Blinkers. We suffer from having blinkers. The post-colonial movement happened all throughout the African continent. So we have examples in case studies, in books, in content that we can look to in terms of how others have done it before. Globally, there's a global movement, the Native Americans, as they call them, or the First Nations, as they like to be called, of Canada, the First Nations of the United States of America, and many indigenous people all around the world are standing up and are saying, this is our land and we want it, and we want to be able to self-determine, and we want to be able to decide what goes and what doesn't go. And I think that that's what we need to start doing. And I think that we need to be in a position wherein, whether you agree with the EFF or you don't agree, you appreciate, you don't appreciate them, but we need to get to a point where we cannot be in a black African country calling a black African party radical. That doesn't make sense to me. How is it that a party that advocates potentially for the lives of black people, for black condition, continues to be called radical, continues to be seen as not mainstream, when 80% of the population is living the very condition that they talk about? And that, I mean, you can remove the EFF as a party, but I'm just talking in general. And that's part of our own decolonization that we need to do in terms of how we think about ourselves and how we think about the Ntokozos of this world. There's nothing that he says that should be radical, because he speaks about, you know, the condition. They speak about our condition. It shouldn't be radical. It should be stuff that we know. It shouldn't even be controversial. But it is controversial because we have been conditioned to be apologists about who we are. We have been conditioned to be shy, scared, and so many other things. And so we have to unlearn respect, and we have to unlearn our conditioning as black people and deal with our internalized racism and decolonize ourselves at an individual level before we can begin the decolonization at a communal level. Thank you very much.
So I'm going to take 2 more comments from the floor.
Like the Fallist movement was a catalyst to like the hair struggle in like the white high schools and what, but they failed to consolidate that struggle, like to move it forward, like and also I understand why the Fallist movement didn't want to mobilize in the broader community, because they didn't want the movement to be hijacked, but they also failed to also consolidate, like mobilize in the community also.
Okay.
But it's an ongoing process, I guess. Thank you.
Okay, hi, my name is Lebogang Tolo, and my comment is, I go to a public university, and no, not a public, a private institute, sorry. And in this private institute, we have so many problems, and we keep acting like everything is okay because public university students look at us and assume that, hey, you go to a private institute, so you obviously have it better than we do. Whereas in all honesty, we don't actually. We are actually in the same boat as everyone. And I would really, really, really love it if people like Ntokozo and everyone else in the panel to come and infiltrate schools, private institutes, because at the end of the day, the private institutes still need they need the approval of basic education. So in all honesty, it is kind of still like a public university, but just a more modernized one. And it would be very amazing if we would have such conversations in private institutes, because children in private institutes are living a fake life. We live a life where we all pretending to be okay. I mean, the black kids that are there, we all pretend like we can afford to be there. We really can't. We're just there because, hey, it is what it is. We have to just go on with life. So I would really, really, really love it if anyone can, when any one of y'all can avail yourselves to maybe come and try to maybe start a movement there, because already we have these problems. We really do have these problems, these same problems that you have. The institute that I go to, there's 2 institutes. There's one in Joburg and one in Cape Town. The differences are beyond, you will never believe it. The Cape Town campus is learning. We are definitely not learning, because majority of the people there are black, and in Cape Town majority is white. So already we don't even have, for example, we don't have a year plan, we don't have a proper syllabus, we don't even know what we're doing. But whereas in Cape Town there is structure, so I'd really appreciate it if we would infiltrate those spaces.
So I'd like to just maybe just look beyond the fees must fall situation I think the challenge that we sit with is cast, and I'm saying this to the panel, cast your vision towards corporate South Africa. And we mentioned it, one of the audience spoke about that. The challenges are that corporate South Africa is also not equal. So what happens is we're going to get a free education. Some of us are going to graduate, some are not going to graduate, and then we're going to enter the world of work and corporate South Africa. And that's when the inequality starts as well. And that's where the fight is at the moment. So that's the fight that I'm busy with. But I'd just like to say to the panel, I stand with you, I stand with the fees must fall, but your bigger challenge is corporate South Africa. So you better roll up your sleeves and be prepared when you enter that, because it's the gates of hell.
Gates of hell. My goodness. And of course, Advocate Bezos, to close off the comments from the audience, Ntokozo Pisho. Go ahead, Advocate.
Thank you very much for the opportunity. You know, I'm over 90 years of age. I expected somebody to define the word that we have been using the whole night. You can say that the billionaire of the beginning of the 19th century was what we call today, what we call. We call it a name that nobody has really defined. The great and did university in the Eastern Cape, who opened minds. He was, what do you call it? What is the word?
Decolonization. Decolonization.
A colonialist.
Oh, okay.
If I understand the majority of the people that spoke here this evening, they say that black people are black people, they have been done wrong, which I have agreed with the whole of my life, not only for people in the ANC, but the PAC, the Black Consciousness Movement, PICO, and others. I'm white. Am I a colonialist? Answer me. Am I a colonialist?
Yeah.
For me, you're a settler. To me, you're a settler. That's to me.
And does that mean that I don't have a vote? I was wrong to be a graduate of Wits University. I was wrong to have 3 sons, 3 of whom have degrees from that university. And I think we must be careful in calling of the separation of black people from the other people that have come to South Africa as a refugee like myself, but others because of poverty in their countries. And it would be unacceptable to the vast majority of the people of South Africa if we say that everybody who is not black is a colonialist and has no power to vote. Let them get out. How many billions of people in South Africa are there? I am not suggesting that the black people have a right to share and share generally. I only learned 2 days ago that the law faculty at WITS is almost black. And the person that gave me that information is near and dear to me. I don't want to identify her. But she told me that the majority of the people at the faculty are black, and of that majority, they are women. I want to take you back to the early 50s when Professor Scholtens said to the class of 45, 2 of whom were women, you must look to your left and you must look to your right. Only a third of you will become graduates in law. And there were 2 women. And he added, if you're a woman, you might as well give up now. We have reached a stage in South Africa where Scholtens and people like this dean that told Nelson Mandela that he couldn't become an advocate because a black person couldn't become an advocate, and forced him to give up that idea and to become an attorney. And I might tell you that I responded as a first-year student that what Malan said in 1948 when he became Prime Minister, that the trouble with Wits University was that they admitted some black people who had no right to be there because they were black. And a person who became an international great doctor, the one prize, Nobel Prize, spoke and said, we will not listen to Dr. Malan and his party. We will do this.
Okay.
I will be brief.
1 more minute, Advocate.
Yes, I actually said at a meeting that if wanting equality for our black fellow students made me a leftist, as the dean of the faculty had said publicly, I plan to be a leftist. I have defended black people, colored people, Indian people, white people, men, women, young and old. I would appeal to our young people in particular that the idea of dividing South Africa into black and white, what are you going to do with the white people? Kick them out? Think about it. And what is going to happen to the people of South Africa if you take out doctors, if you take out engineers, if you take out people who devoted themselves to the end of apartheid? Are you saying that they don't deserve to continue living in South Africa? Would you kick me out? Thank you for listening.
That brings us to, thank you very much, Advocate George Bezos, for your contribution. That brings us to the end of the conversation we're having. I'm going to give each of the panelists 2 minutes each to give their closing remarks. I know from the look on their faces that 2 minutes probably is insufficient, but time is as it is. I would like to say, before I allow our panelists to close, in just a quick response to Advocate George Bezos's, I don't know, I think that it would be a mistake to assume that when young people or black people agitate for an improvement of the black condition in this country, for a return of the wealth via the land, that automatically means the kicking out of the white population in this country. I don't think that that's the conversation that we have been having today. I think the conversation that has been happening today is an articulation of what the black condition in this country is right now, why it's wrong, the different ways in which it is harmful to the majority of the population in this country, the different reasons why it's important for us to begin to have these conversations, as difficult as they may be for both sides of the coin, and importance for us to say that the reconciliation project has not worked for the majority of the people in this country, to be very honest. And that is an important beginning, I believe, to the conversation. I believe that if the populations outside of the black population in this country want to join in the future of where South Africa is going as a whole, they need to understand that this conversation is necessary. They need to understand that there are certain things that will need to be given up by the minority in this country in order for all of us to share in the wealth of this country. There are certain concessions that will have to come from sectors of society in order for this country to move forward. And if that does not happen, we will find ourselves in a very precarious and very dangerous situation. I'm going to start with you, Funzani.
I think, like, I'm always faced with like a bit of like a quagmire whenever someone asks me about white people and the role of white people, because my thinking literally revolves around the black condition and how we can improve the lives of black people. So it's always like, even when we speak realistically, if we were to say even if we wanted to actually take out white people from the country, how do we even begin to do that, right? And I don't like that conversation. I don't want to speak about white people and their contribution and what they are going to do and what we are going to do and what is our response to them, because it's always in a sense that it's always in a sense that they want us to take us back to that guilt tripping of why you're not even thinking about us. We are part of South Africa. But the entire time when they were thinking about themselves, they were not necessarily considering us as humans, right? And I think I have a problem with having to answer such questions, because, particularly because of that, and it gets to a point where I really get angry about that, because I'm just thinking, I have to go back to the townships, and the townships are a depiction, are literally a daily reminder that my people, which are the black people, still suffer in this very country that they call their own, which is not necessarily theirs, right? And so it becomes a thing of, why must I think about white people? I have other things to think about, which is the conditions of black people, and what we are finding ourselves in. And I'm trying to gather young black people to say, let's begin to have conversations about how we are going to move forward as a people that has been stripped of our dignity, our culture, and everything that makes us human, right? And so, I don't even want to get into that conversation, guys. I'm sorry. So I'm not going to subject myself to that. Just quickly, I wanted to say, in the wake of the femicide that has been happening in this country, there's a total shutdown that is organized by black women that is happening on the 1st of August. I'm not necessarily part of the organizers, guys. I think how is, but then it's seriously like an act of resistance. Essentially, we want to completely shut down the country as women, particularly women. So please get yourself involved. On Facebook, it's called, I don't know if I'm allowed to even do this, but then there's a group on Facebook that's called Total Shutdown, the 1st of August. Please check it out and please get yourself involved on it. Thank you guys for being here.
I think, in closing, we need to sort of go back to how we started. And how we started is, the Flawless movement was about and continues to be about black people. And that is the center on which we are focused. I think, I had thought that we were past the conversation of not all white people, the conversation of we've contributed, the conversation of continuing to center white bodies on the face of black pain, where black people are saying there's something fundamentally wrong with society, but we are faced with having to think, what will happen to the white people? Poor white people. I think white people are sorted. Why must I, as a black person, be subjected to having to think what's going to happen with the white people when I take back my land? I think the fact that we have to, constantly explain this position, and it's a long-standing position. We must be clear, as Fanon teaches us, white people, no matter how progressive they are, never cease to be part of white settler society. And that is as a result of their path to privilege, which is their skin. No matter how progressive a white person is, they continue to enjoy benefits of our dispossession, benefits of our resources, which are unearned. And when we say we want to get them back, I'm confused. Honestly, I continue to be confused. I want someone maybe one day to explain to me why I must then consider what will happen to the white people. Why is that my conversation? Biko has given a mandate to white people to say, if you want to contribute, that conversation, advocates, I think you should be having with white people. And I hope you continue to. I really hope that you have the conversation, and you, among ourselves as white people, you resolve among ourselves what the role of a white person is in South Africa, in this particular South Africa where we want to undo the wrongs. It's not our place. I'm exhausted as a black person. I'm fighting the struggle of my people, and black people are at the center of my discourse. White people by themselves must sort themselves out. It's not my mess. You are not mine. This is it.
So I'm just going to keep it very short. With regards to corporates, with regards to disgruntled people, like I said, I'm yet to see it. And I'm hoping in the next 6 months when we go into 2019, we will see exactly how disgruntled people are when we have to go and vote. Right? And we must also remember that we are in the state of disgruntlement under a specific government that's been there for over 23 years and will continue to do the exact same thing. So for me, show your disgruntlement where it has a tangible effect. Because I don't think anyone is taking protesting seriously anymore. It's like it's a black tradition now. If black people don't protest, then something is wrong. They have to protest. I mean, this is black culture. That's what blackness does. So for me, I wouldn't like to see the disgruntlement through protesting or through any other means outside of the ballot. Outside of that Bezos, I mean, we're here in your building, my guy. We're George Bezos. We're here in your building. I think for me, that alone is me giving you and white people attention just by physically being in this building. But outside of that, with all due respect, I do respect a lot of the work that you have done, and I will continue to respect the work that you have done and you continue to do. However, I am currently in a state where I think it's okay for us black people to just huddle up in a corner and then love each other. I'm doing love work now. I want to love my people and I want my people to love themselves, because the root of that love will hopefully assist in this femicide crisis that we have in the country. It will assist with, the violence that we experience on a daily basis in our townships, out of our townships, and in our daily life. So at the moment, I just want to love my people. If white people want to leave the country, hey, that'd be great. But I really don't care what they do. At this point in time, I'm focused on black people, and I want to do the work of loving black people and getting them to love themselves. My sister there, I just need an invitation. Just tell me what institution this is. I'm always ready to go. I've always got a good fight in me. I hope the police are not watching this, otherwise I've got cases that are going to come up. But outside of that, thank you very much for joining us. Like I had mentioned, the work of Fees Must Fall, it hasn't ended. There's a lot more work that needs to be done. There's a lot of self-love that needs to go into individuals, not only in the movement, outside of the movement. There's a lot that needs to be done at grassroots level as well, and this is the work that we need to do collectively. I unfortunately can't be 55 million people at the same time. I can only just be me. I'm going to need you to assist me in liberating us. We're basically liberating us. I need you to come to the party. So thank you.
Thank you, Busi. We set out this afternoon to try and address the question of whether or not the Fallist movement achieved its aims. I don't think that we've discussed that question at all, which is fine. But in terms of answering it, I suppose it's where it comes from which prism you view the Fallist movement. Do you believe that they were there to be a catalyst, to set alight a fire that had been dimmed? Do you believe that they existed to change an entire system in the amount of time that they've existed? And I think that that's a question that we'll all have to answer for ourselves. But what has been instructive for me personally in the conversation we've had today is that instead of addressing this the question that is up behind us, we've had a more urgent conversation, which is about the black condition in this country. What it means, what it feels like, its effects. And it has been an honest conversation, a difficult conversation. And I hope that it will be a conversation that will continue beyond this room. Even to the people who are watching us at home, I understand we have a live stream going. And I think that this is a conversation that was undeniably amplified by the Fallist movement. It was a conversation that was amplified by the youth of 1976. It is a conversation that has been going on in this country for far too long. And I think that we need to get to a point where actions result from the conversations that we're having. So I would like to challenge everyone who has been with us today to do the work in your own spaces. Any work that requires to be done, because we are all culpable. We are all accountable for what happens in this country going forward. In particular, young people. because we're the ones who are going to have to live with the results of the decisions that are being made right now, that are being made in Parliament, that are being made in union buildings, that are being made in other spaces of power, and are being made by people who will not have to live with their consequences. We will have to. And so, as Busi has said, we're going into elections next year. Take the time to think about your choice very, very carefully. And also to understand that democracy does not start and end at the ballot box. It is every single day of our lives, the way we move and speak in the spaces that we're in. I'd like to thank you for your time, especially your patience, because we have run late. I hope that you believe that this has been a good way to spend your time today. Thank you.